Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're taking a deep breath and diving into a really big topic, the history of Israel.
Yeah, immense is the word.
We've got this fascinating source material here, basically a single document that, well, it covers thousands of years, ancient times right up to the mid-90s.
And it touches on pretty much everything, doesn't it? Geography, biblical stories, modern wars, culture, society, it's all in there.
It really is. And the source itself highlights how much the location matters.
Absolutely. Israel's unique spot in the Middle East Mediterranean coast, borders with Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Egypt. Very diverse geography, too.
Coasts, valleys, deserts, mountains.
And overlooking key shipping routes. That whole geographic crossroads idea, the source says it's woven right into the history. It's not just scenery.
Definitely. So our mission today, for you listening, is to unpack this dense material. We want to pull out the key insights, those real nuggets, and make this complex history, well, a bit more approachable.
Think of it as a guided tour through the source. A shortcut, maybe, to getting a handle on this unique story. A story of resilience, struggle, and ultimately rebirth.
Right. We'll basically follow the source's structure, looking at three main chunks of time: before the state existed, the founding years, and then the period of consolidation and peace efforts, plus some later issues the source brings up.
It's a history filled with, trials, setbacks, victories, defeats. And the source really hammers home how that past shapes the present.
Okay, let's get into it then. Starting right at the beginning, ancient history, the biblical foundations according to the source.
Yeah, the source kicks off with that core narrative, the promise of the land, the journey to Egypt, enslavement,
The Exodus under Moses?
and then the return to the Holy Land. The source frames the building of the kingdom as a real high point, a zenith,
And the flip side.
the destruction of Jerusalem and the exile. That's presented as a moment of, profound disgrace, a real low point.
And within that narrative, the source emphasizes certain themes, like overcoming hardship.
It does, yeah. Stories like Joseph's rise from prisoner to power in Egypt, or the whole Exodus story itself, they're highlighted for showing the oppressed being delivered, the humiliated being lifted up.
The Exodus seems particularly central in the source's telling.
It's presented as crucial, yeah.
Yeah.
Guaranteeing national existence and independence for people who were basically laborers in Egypt.
Interesting. The source also touches on kind of different ways to look at the Exodus story itself.
Right, it brings in an analytical angle. It notes that the laws and legal stuff mixed into the story make a purely scientific view tricky.
So it acknowledges complexity there.
Yeah, it suggests you could see it as a history of miracles, demonstrating what it calls the economica of faith, the practical working out of belief, maybe. Or it says maybe just as a mere literary invention. It puts both possibilities out there.
Before the kingdom, though, the source introduces the patriarchs and matriarchs.
Yes, the founders, the role models. The source actually spends a fair bit of time on the dynamics between them. Rivalries, shared traits that make the stories feel, relatable.
Like what kind of traits or stories?
We have common motifs like chance meetings leading to marriage, and definitely sibling rivalries.
And it uses some pretty strong language for some figures.
It does. Sarah and Hagar are mentioned, with Sarah. Maybe not shown in the best light in that relationship. Rebecca's family, her father Laban, called a schemer.
A den of thieves, I think the source says.
That's the phrase, yeah. But Rebecca herself is shown as strong, assertive, rivaling Sarah in that sense.
And there's that recurring idea about exile and marriage.
Exactly. How marriage choices could lead to a kind of exile or separation. The source mentions Isaac and Rebecca maybe using this against Esau's marriages or guiding Jacob's choices. Even death and burial details, like for Abraham and Sarah, are treated as significant dual events.
So from these beginnings, we get the emergence of a more formal political unit, the kingdom.
Right. The United Monarchy.
Yeah.
Saul, David, Solomon. Roughly 1020 to 930 BCE. The source calls this the first real political entity to come out of that earlier tribal setup, calls it a golden era.
David and Solomon are obviously key figures here.
Very much so. David's leadership, even his sensuousness, as the source puts it, is seen as drawing the nation closer to God. Solomon's known for piety, wisdom, wealth-centering unity on the temple he built, forging international ties.
But it wasn't all perfect, according to the source.
Not at all. It explicitly mentions their moral failings, questionable decisions, things that ultimately paved the way for the kingdom to split.
Which led to the divided monarchy around 930 BCE.
Yes, the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah.
And that division had disastrous consequences.
Catastrophic, yeah. The source details the destruction of the northern kingdom, Israel, its capital Samaria, by the Assyrians.
And then later, Judah.
Later, the Babylonians under Nebuchadnezzar besieged and completely destroyed Jerusalem, Judah's capital, in 586 BCE, wiped out the Davidic dynasty, a major turning point.
Marking the start of the Babylonian exile.
Which the source describes as a massive cultural shock for the Judeans taken to Babylon. That lasted from 586 to 539 BCE.
How did their focus shift during that time?
Dramatically. From lost cities and land to preserving lost traditions. The source has this striking image of them using papyrus from their captors to write down prayers, chronicles, elegies, a way to maintain identity and cry out to God.
But it wasn't permanent. There was a return.
Yes, a return to Judah, which the source dates between 539 and 516 BCE. Jerusalem's walls were rebuilt. But interestingly, the source notes a new temple wasn't fully completed until much later, after Alexander the Great.
The source gives a bit more detail on the exile itself, too. It wasn't just one event.
No, it clarifies it happened in two main stages. Deportations in 597, then the big one, the siege and destruction in 586. It mentions the background, like King Jehoiakim opposing Nebuchadnezzar.
And the siege itself.
Terrible famine, the temple looted, walls breached, thousands deported. Though the source does note some people were left behind, and Jerusalem was even sort of left unattended for a while under vassal rulers.
Okay, fast forwarding quite a bit now, we reach the Roman period. The source calls this a watershed.
Definitely. Pompey capturing Jerusalem in 63 BCE. That kicked off 3 centuries under Roman rule. And the source says Jews at the time saw this differently. Some as God's judgment, others maybe even as deliverance.
But the reality was foreign domination.
Yes, though the source makes an interesting distinction. Earlier foreign rule often involved huge upheaval, but maybe ended with hope for restoration. Roman rule brought a kind of political stability.
Stability under occupation.
Well, stability in the sense of a consistent ruling power, even if foreign. And the source says this stability came to be married with nomism.
Nomism, what's that?
The source uses it to mean a really strong focus on religious law and tradition as the core of identity and community life. Especially after the defeats under Rome, this nomism, in a kind of hybrid form in the diaspora, became crucial for sustaining Jewish identity.
That makes sense. The source also steps back a bit before Rome, mentioning earlier struggles.
Right. After Alexander the Great died, his successors, the Ptolemies in Egypt, the Seleucids in Syria, fought over the region. Judea was caught in the middle, periods of tyranny, glimpses of autonomy.
And Greek influence was spreading, Hellenization.
Yes, a big factor. Greek culture, trade. It created religious and social tensions. Groups like the Pharisees emerged, partly in opposition to this Hellenizing trend.
Which eventually boiled over into revolts.
Major ones. Against the Seleucids first, then the Romans. The source details the Maccabean revolt against the Seleucids, starting in 167 BCE, led by Matthias and his sons, especially Judas Maccabeus.
The Hanukkah story.
Exactly. They achieved surprising victories, recaptured Jerusalem, cleansed the temple in 164 BCE, that's Hanukkah. This led to the Hasmonean dynasty ruling for about 80 years, but eventually they had their own internal conflicts.
And that internal strife kind of opened the door for Rome.
That's how the source presents it, yeah. Decades of Hasmonean infighting, then Pompey marches in, 63 BCE, Jerusalem falls.
Then we get Herod the Great.
Son of Antipater, ruling around the time of Jesus' birth. Known for massive building projects, especially reconstructing the temple in Jerusalem. An incredible 46-year project, the source says.
A period of building, but also leading towards another disaster.
Tragically, yes. The destruction of that temple by the Romans under Titus in 70 CE. The source gives stark figures: 1.3 million Jews killed, nearly 100,000 taken captive in that war. It explicitly links this back to Nebuchadnezzar's destruction centuries earlier. That cycle of loss.
Okay, moving past Rome, the Byzantine and Islamic periods, what does the source say?
So 4th century AD, the Roman Empire becomes Christian, the Byzantine era. Judea becomes a Christian realm. The source notes Jews were expelled from Jerusalem, forbidden to return. This led, it says, to a decline in Jewish presence there.
But Jewish life continued elsewhere.
Yes, major centers developed in the Galilee. Jerusalem became a huge Christian pilgrimage site, big construction projects like the Church of the Holy Sepulchre.
But that Christian rule didn't last forever.
No, it collapsed in 614 with the Sasanian Persian conquest. Churches destroyed, the source says. Then, mid-7th century, the Arab conquests begin the Islamic period. Caliph Omar captures Jerusalem.
How did Muslim rule affect other religions there?
According to the source, they allowed different religious groups to worship as long as they paid a specific tax, the jizya.
And a very important Islamic structure was built then.
The Dome of the Rock.
Yeah.
Right on the Temple Mount. Hugely significant for Muslims, Muhammad's ascension site, they believe. And the source points out, right near where the Jewish temple's Holy of Holies stood, a complex layering of sacred space.
After that initial period, the source brings in the Crusades.
Starting around 1099, when European crusaders captured Jerusalem, the source calls this the first flush of European imperialism. They set up crusader states.
And their actions.
Ruthless, the source says, against local Muslims and Jews. A really violent, turbulent time for the region.
Jerusalem changed hands multiple times.
Yeah, lost and recaptured. More crusades launched from Europe, often failing. These crusader kingdoms finally ended around 1291, defeated by Egyptian Mamluk forces. The source sees them as a distinct phase of European involvement.
Which brings us to the long stretch of Ottoman rule.
Starting in 1516, a key mention is Suleiman Aysen building the current walls around Jerusalem's Old City.
And Ottoman administration.
Generally preserve religious rights, the source indicates. Rabbinical leaders handled the Jewish community's internal affairs.
But tensions arose later in the 19th century.
Yes, especially between Christian groups and Muslims over rights at the holy places. This friction played a role, among other things, in the Crimean War.
And the outcome of that war.
Peace treaties gave European powers like Russia and France specific rights related to religious sites, a complex balance under overall Ottoman rule. The source also gives some 19th century population figures for Jerusalem, about 15,000 total. Roughly 6,500 Jews, 6,000 Muslims, 2,500 Christians, a mixed city.
Okay, shifting now towards the modern era, the beginnings of modern Zionism.
Right. The source stresses that while the desire to return was ancient, organized, modern efforts really took off in the 19th century.
And the key event.
The First Zionist Congress in Basel, Switzerland, 1897, led by Theodor Herzl, seen as the real start of the modern Zionist political movement aiming for a return to the homeland through political, cultural, educational, economic means.
And the source connects this to broader trends.
Definitely. Places it squarely within the rise of nationalism everywhere in the 19th century. For Jews, this was powerfully fueled by widespread anti-Semitism in Europe. Palestine was seen as the place for this national revival, reconnecting with the Jewish past.
The source adds a nuance, though, about colonial undertones.
It does mention that, suggesting that from some perspectives, the way the movement operated, especially regarding land and the existing Arab population, could be seen through a colonial lens. It acknowledges that complexity, and reviving Hebrew was central to the project.
This movement fueled waves of immigration, the Aliyahs.
Yes. The first Aliyah, 1882 to 1903, mostly Jews fleeing persecution in Eastern Europe. They founded many early agricultural settlements.
Were there tensions within the Jewish community then?
The source notes socioeconomic differences and clashes between different Jewish groups. It mentions how later developed areas, like parts of Tel Aviv, became associated with newer, poorer immigrants, causing social friction.
And the second Aliyah?
Early 1900s, again mostly from Eastern Europe. The source draws a contrast. Some immigrants were just escaping oppression. Others were driven by this intense Zionist energy to build a whole new world, often rejecting old European ways.
And interactions with the Arab population.
Crucially, the source states that labor competition with Arabs resulted in enmity and violence during this time. It calls the Second Aliyah a tragic and heroic epic.
This leads us into the British Mandate period after World War I.
Right. The Ottoman Empire collapses, the Middle East gets redrawn, Palestine comes under discussion as a potential place for Jewish national restoration. Britain gets the mandate from the League of Nations to govern the territory.
And during the war, that key document, the Balfour Declaration.
November 2nd, 1917. The British government expresses sympathy for Zionist goals, supports establishing a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. The source calls it a powerful act of state with French and U.S. backing.
Making it significant internationally.
Hugely significant. From a Jewish perspective, the source notes it was vital for gaining international legitimacy for a movement that started small. But it also acknowledges the profound ongoing consequences it had.
And under the mandate, Arab-Jewish tensions really escalated.
Dramatically. Fueled by Islamic revival, Palestinian nationalism, British support for Jewish immigration, Arab resistance grew stronger, targeting British rule but also opposing the Balfour Declaration as Zionist activity increased.
And this turned violent.
Yes. Riots in 1920, again in 1929, initially sparked by disputes over the Wailing Wall in Jerusalem. But the source notes a shift towards what it calls anti-Zionist violence and terror, with attacks on Jewish communities and institutions.
Culminating in the Arab Revolt of 1936-1939.
A major uprising. Started with a general strike, spread into widespread conflict. The source links it to built-up Arab grievances, anger at British rule, the changing demographics from immigration, and the feeling that British Zionist cooperation harmed Arab interests.
What was the impact of that revolt?
It lasted years, had complex results. It certainly strengthened Arab opposition and militancy, drew support from other Arab countries. But the source also points to downsides for the Arabs: harsh British suppression, loss of credibility for some leaders, and highlighting internal Arab divisions.
Except for the Jewish community, the Yishuv.
The source says they suffered, but actually emerged much better state, more powerful and consolidated. The shock forced greater unity, spurred organization. They essentially built an underground state, prepping their economy, politics, military society for what seemed like inevitable future conflict.
Which brings us right to the edge of 1948 and the creation of the state.
By 1947, the situation was so tense the UN stepped in. They recommended partitioning Palestine into separate Jewish and Arab states. Jerusalem was to be international.
How was that plan received?
Palestinian leaders rejected it, according to the source, perhaps expecting the British to scrap it anyway. Jewish leaders accepted it, partly as a signal for peace. But both sides were already preparing for war. A civil war was essentially underway before the mandate even ended.
The UN vote itself was a landmark moment.
November 29, 1947. The General Assembly approves partition, 33-13. The source calls this a huge symbolic victory for Jewish aspirations, especially so soon after the Holocaust. But it crucially adds, not a single Arab nation recognized the partition plan. Riots broke out immediately.
Leading to the Declaration of Independence.
May 14, 1948. As the British mandate officially expires, David Ben-Gurion declares the establishment of the State of Israel, reaffirming that historical connection to the land.
And the immediate reaction?
War. Within hours, armies from Egypt, Jordan, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon attacked. The 1948 Arab-Israeli War, Israel's War of Independence. The source says they were united in their intentions to destroy the young nation.
What about the balance of forces? The source seems a bit contradictory.
It is interesting phrasing. It mentions the small Jewish population versus the insurmountable resources of the Arab states, calling Arab forces overwhelming. But then it says the small, brave Israeli nation triumphed despite the discrepancy. And perhaps, in a way, due to its overwhelming advantages.
Advantages like what?
It doesn't spell it out, but implies things beyond just numbers. Maybe better organization, clearer motivation, unified command. The Jewish defense groups had just unified into the IDF. The outcome was Israel controlled more territory than the partition plan originally allocated.
So after that incredibly difficult start, the source describes the post-48 period as a real breakthrough, despite ongoing problems.
Yeah, politically, Israel quickly gained international recognition, joined the UN. Domestically, rapid progress in technology, economy, society, education, especially agriculture, which was a big focus.
And the military remained crucial.
Huge efforts to modernize the IDF, make it one of the world's best. But the source stresses this happened under constant threat, continuous conflict, proxy wars, especially involving Egypt.
And massive immigration defined this era.
The mass migration. Huge waves of Jews arrived, causing explosive population growth from all over the Middle East, North Africa, later the Soviet Union.
Changing Israeli society profoundly.
In every way. Food, culture, politics, city life, the army, everything was impacted. And the source acknowledges absorbing so many people so fast was a massive challenge.
What about the economy right after the war?
In rough shape. The source says almost total destruction. Lost capital, took a decade just to get back to 1946 output levels. They adopted an emergency policy due to instability.
Leading to financial strain.
Yeah, the source mentions being in a constant state of bankruptcy, tight government control over foreign currency, a tough start.
Yet the Israeli miracle image emerged.
The source notes that irony. It suggests this image came from active state intervention that did stabilize things, balanced foreign exchange, sparked recovery. But it also warns that by the 1970s, the limits of that state-led model were showing. Official reports flagged concerns about future growth.
Okay, moving into the next phase. Consolidation, more conflicts, but also peace efforts, kicking off around 1967.
Yeah, the tensions obviously didn't go away after 48. Skirmishes continued, both sides were preparing for more conflict.
And the defining conflict of this period in the source is the Six-Day War.
June 5th to 10th, 1967. Against Egypt, Jordan, Syria. A swift, decisive Israeli victory, the source states clearly.
And the main outcome? Territorial change.
Huge changes. Israel captured the Gaza Strip and Sinai Peninsula from Egypt, the Golan Heights from Syria, and the West Bank, including East Jerusalem from Jordan.
A massive expansion.
Enormous. Added significant territory and over 1 million Palestinians to the population under Israeli administration. This created brand new political dilemmas, international fallout, and deeply intensified the conflict.
And UN Resolution 242 followed.
Yes, calling for Israeli withdrawal from territories occupied. But the source notes the resolution did not specify on which basis, leaving room for interpretation and disagreement later.
The source mentions other conflicts briefly, too.
The War of Attrition, 67 to 70. Egypt trying to regain Sinai, which the source says they didn't achieve then. This really set the stage for the Yom Kippur War.
Tell us about the Yom Kippur War in 1973.
October 73. Grew out of those post-67 tensions. The source highlights Egyptian President Sadat's aims: recover Sinai, restore Arab pride. It was costly for everyone involved, but the source says it did ultimately push Egypt and Israel towards serious negotiations.
And the source also discusses the Lebanon War.
Explains it started with Palestinian groups using southern Lebanon as a base for attacks on Israel. Lebanon itself was deeply fractured. Palestinian factions, Christian militias, described by the sources pro-Hebrew and hating Palestinians, left-wing Shiite groups linked to Iran. A real mess.
Israel's goal there?
To expel the PLO, according to the source. It describes the military escalation that began the war.
So lots of conflict, but this period also saw major peace initiatives, right?
Yes. Despite what the source calls a backdrop of ceaseless disappointments and outrage in peace talks. It mentions slogans like yes to peace, no to occupied land. It points to figures like Yitzhak Rabin talking about a new dawn.
And Rabin's assassination later.
The source views it as a dark sign, a harbinger note that stalled discussions and dimmed hope. It even mentions different reactions. Palestinians feeling unprepared, other Arabs in dismay.
But before that tragedy, the Camp David Accords were a huge step.
Absolutely. September 1978, Israel's begin, Egypt's Sadat, mediated by U.S. President Carter, the main goals. Egypt recognizes Israel, relations normalize.
What was agreed?
Israel agreed to withdraw completely from Sinai, dismantle settlements and bases there. Egypt agreed to full diplomatic relations, recognition. They also agreed to negotiate about the West Bank and Gaza's future, a landmark treaty between Israel and a major Arab neighbor.
And then involving the PLO directly. The Oslo Accords.
Negotiated secretly, mediated by President Clinton. Key players: Rabin, Arafat, Peres, Abbas. Oslo already signed September 93, Oslo II, September 95.
What were the core ideas of Oslo, according to the source?
Oslo. I set up a Palestinian self-governing authority, transferring internal security and civil administration for most Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza. It obliged both sides to negotiate a permanent settlement on the really tough issues: borders, refugees, security, Jerusalem. Self-rule started in Gaza and Jericho.
And mutual recognition.
Yes, crucially, Oslo. I included the first mutual recognition between Israel and the PLO.
But the source is also critical of Oslo. It mentions flaws.
It is quite critical. It calls the secrecy around Oslo before signing its Achilles heel. It suggests the process was maybe too idealistic, ignoring realities, and argues it had fundamental flaws in the deals and the process itself.
How so?
It describes the process as basically designed, controlled, and unilaterally conducted by the U.S. And then it makes the very strong, controversial claim that the Accords actually only abetted Israeli expansionism further. That's a significant perspective presented in the source.
Okay, let's shift to the contemporary issues the source highlights, mainly reflecting the situation up to the mid-1990s. Geopolitical challenges remain central.
Definitely. The source reiterates Israel's situation operating in what it terms a hostile Muslim environment, continuous conflict with neighbors, facing conventional threats but also asymmetrical ones like Hezbollah.
And the cost of that?
High defense spending is noted as a burden, a quarter to a third of GDP sometimes.
The source paints a picture of daily life under security pressure.
Very vividly.
Yeah.
Mentions air raid sirens tested daily since 1948, visible preparedness, buffer forests, shelters. It explicitly says normality. Just means something different there.
And connects this back to deeper historical feelings.
Yes, it notes the land of Israel is now seen as absolutely essential, a sine qua non for Jewish survival after millennia, those ancient daydreams and threats awakening into reality, making the land itself a formidable presence.
The Israeli-Palestinian conflict, especially post-67, is obviously key here.
The source discusses the occupation. It states Israel annexed East Jerusalem and the Golan Heights, though it adds the wider territories captured weren't formally annexed.
And the situation for Palestinians in those territories.
The source notes a lack of legal protections and makes strong claims about civilian suffering, mentioning disproportionate death and torment and massacres. It does add that Israel was aware of its obligations under the Geneva Conventions.
The source also tracks territorial expansion itself.
Between 67 and 89, it says, Israel's control expanded to include all of historic Palestine, plus the Golan Heights, land larger than pre-67 Israel. This is linked to security needs and maintaining Israel's Jewish character.
And the status of the Palestinian population changed.
According to the source, they went from a recognized minority within Israel, pre-67, to what it calls a denigrated non-entity internationally in the occupied territories, lacking government or national recognition, while their representation was debated globally.
Settlement policy gets a lot of attention in the source.
Described as systematic, pursued with fervor, determination, and continuity after 1967, accelerating under different governments. The source claims these settlements are now so entrenched they cannot be significantly rescinded.
What drives settlement policy, according to the source?
It sees it as complex political, economic, military, ideological factors all playing a role, competition between factions. And the source alleges this benefits settlers at the expense of the Palestinians' livelihood and welfare. It mentions settlements, infrastructure, buffer zones built amidst these tensions.
The source also touches on international relations perspectives.
It frames the conflicts starting with Israel's historical claim, the UN partition, the Arab invasion. It says Israel, backed by post-war powers, defended itself and expanded. Then it argues Israel denied its ardor for peace by lending zero attention to UN resolutions calling for withdrawal.
That's a strong claim.
Yes. And it controversially links Israel's intense security focus, calling it a securitization project, to regional instability and daily violence. It even goes so far as to link the perceived lack of hope for Palestinians and in Egypt to sparking the Arab Spring uprisings later in Tunisia and Egypt. These are definitely pointed perspectives presented by the source.
Okay, let's switch gears to demographics and society as described in the source. What's the picture?
Around 1989, population about 5 million, roughly 82% Jewish, 18% non-Jewish, mostly Arab Muslims, Christians, Druze. Young population, highly urbanized, 90% city dwellers, major centers. Jerusalem, Haifa, Tel Aviv.
Development status.
Called developed or developing.
Yeah.
And the source states it's the only fully democratic country in the Middle East with high literacy, 95%.
It's also described as a welfare state.
Yeah. Highlights an advanced social welfare system developed post-48. National Insurance Institute provides pensions, family allowances, unemployment benefits.
Health.
Comprehensive national health insurance covers most people. Free services via nonprofits. Good health outcomes, life expectancy around 79 then. Low infant mortality. High ratio of doctors, partly due to immigration.
And the population's diversity is really emphasized.
Hugely. Jews from over 60 countries. Arabic widely used alongside Hebrew. Significant Arab Israeli population with civic rights, voting rights. Other minorities too, Druze. Immigrants from the former Soviet Union, foreign workers.
What about media and military?
Free press in multiple languages, national and commercial broadcasters. Mandatory IDF service for most men and women, with a national service alternative.
The source also looks at social challenges and how policy evolved.
As policies often developed incrementally, reacting to problems. The post-60s era was key for social policy growth. Big expansion in education after 48. Notes periods of harsh criticism of the older establishment.
Persistent problems mentioned.
Poverty and discrimination, racial, spatial, leading to urban-suburban divides. It mentions a specific 5-year plan post-66 to tackle this, but suggests it led to disappointment, maybe due to how administrative lines were drawn, creating visible wealth gaps between central cities and poorer suburbs.
Finally, the source covers cultural contributions.
Positions Israel as a real crossroads. Culture blending Jewish traditions with local influences, architecture, literature, music, painting, and emphasizes again that remarkable revival of Hebrew as a living language.
Literature seems like a major focus.
Described as constantly growing, original, shaped by the landscape and diverse society. Mentions famous novelist Agnon, Amichai, Oz, whose work often grapples with war's impact. Children's literature, too. The source calls the prose output prodigious, especially for a culture revived in what it earlier called a desolation.
And performing arts.
Hebrew theater, started late 19th century, seen as flourishing. A state theater, smaller venues exploring local themes, even in Arabic or Yiddish. Music is highlighted too, blending East and West into melting pot sounds, influencing classical and modern music, with many artists performing globally.
And the last big area, science and technology.
The source really hypes this up, calls Israel a scientific powerhouse. Significant advances in science, medicine, computers benefiting the world, notes an astounding number of scientists, publications, Nobel Prizes for its size.
It lists key institutions.
Weizmann Institute, Hebrew University, Tel Aviv University, the Technion, Ben-Gurion University leading research centers.
And gives concrete examples of breakthroughs.
Yeah, things like nanofiltration, mechanobiology, a device for killing blood cancer cells, specific agricultural chemicals, computer algorithms, cancer cell modeling, world firsts. It really stresses how high this output is for the population size.
So to wrap this all up, it's been an immense journey the source takes us on.
Truly. Over 3,000 years condensed. Conquests, destruction, exile, return, different rulers, ending with the rebirth of a sovereign nation after centuries.
And the source almost personifies the land itself.
Yeah, describes the land as bearing the indelible mark of age, of greatness, and of decay, as having quietly transcribed this whole human drama, temptation, defiance, conquest, punishment, exile, loss, but always anticipating return, restoration.
There's a feeling of ongoing lament in the source's description, but also resilience.
Definitely. A continuous lament over history, death, martyrs, but also the emergence of scholars, the preservation of tradition even under oppression, and that recurring call the source highlights, return, O children of Israel, return to the land of your father.
It's just a history of incredible depth, resilience, and constant challenge right through the period the source covers.
Absolutely. The source makes it crystal clear. You really can't grasp the realities and complexities of modern Israel without understanding this long, tangled, often painful past.
Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive exploring this source material on the history of Israel. It's certainly a unique and compelling story.
A very dense and layered history, no doubt.
So as a final thought for you to take away, considering everything we've discussed, this epic history of struggle, exile, return, conflict, rebuilding, and the source's point about the land of Israel now being seen as that sine qua non, that absolute necessity for Jewish survival. How does this incredibly deep and complex past fundamentally shape the present reality, the ongoing challenges for everyone living in or connected to that land today?
That's the core question, isn't it? The weight of that history. Exile, return, persecution, conflict, building a state. It isn't just academic, according to this source. It shapes perceptions, politics, identity, security fears, aspirations for both Jews and Palestinians living there. It means the past isn't really past. It's constantly present, creating this incredibly complex reality for everyone involved, raising those profound questions about belonging, rights, and what the future holds.
Indeed. Something profound to reflect on. We encourage you to continue exploring these vital and complex topics.